On June 18th, 2020, myself and a group of my quarantined loved ones gathered in our Chicago home to experience one of the most highly anticipated media events of our lives. After 7 years in development, multiple delays, and the horrific irony of a very real pandemic, we were now hours away from the surreal reality of playing a sequel to The Last of Us. Now, we've all collectively been through a lot recently, so let's have a quick recap. The story of grizzled smuggler Joel and his virally immune companion Ellie navigating a savage and ruinous world is considered to be one of, if not the greatest video game of all time. Game developer Naughty Dog's now classic tale of loss, endurance, survival, and love became a smash hit with critics and audiences alike through its innovative gameplay, complex themes, and remarkably deep characters. However, the game's rich and rounded story was made possible in part by one defining quality: it wasn't built with a sequel in mind. The Last of Us remains a standalone masterpiece on its own merits to this day, and even with its prequel DLC left behind to flesh out its world a bit more, a continuation of its story was never thought to be warranted, let alone expected. And then, out of a clear blue sky, this happened. The announcement and reveal of Part 2 started a hype train that quickly reached terminal velocity. Fans clamored for a release date. Naughty Dog's creative director and co-writer of Part 2, Neil Druckmann, refused to announce until the game was closer to completion. Finally, in September of 2019, our prayers were answered, only to be delayed a month later. But some gameplay here, an interview there, some excited tweets from Neil and cast members sprinkled on top. For a moment, it looked like everything was going to be okay.
This now makes the first coronavirus death confirmed in the U.S.
The World Health Organization has declared coronavirus a global pandemic with more than 118,000.
Once the dust settled, Sony put out a press release saying that while it was almost finished, Part 2 had been delayed indefinitely, while Naughty Dog focused on delivering with nearly its entire staff working remotely. Now, while I can't speak for the rest of the fan base, not then and certainly not now, that last part gave me some hope. Naughty Dog had already delayed the game once, citing standards of quality. If they were working this hard already, crunching as hard as they were, once they got past the shift to working remotely, certainly nothing would stop this game from being released now. Later that same month, a trove of dev footage, gameplay, and major plot events leaked online, igniting a firestorm, but we'll get to that later. With an exhausted staff, an irate fanbase, a ravenous press, and a compromised product, Druckmann, Naughty Dog, and Sony pushed Part 2's release date to its final resting place of June 19th, 2020. A review embargo was implemented to protect the rest of the game's story. As the game's release slowly approached and anticipation continued to build, Naughty Dog effectively went dark. What happened after the game's release remains unclear. Let's analyze for a moment what we know for sure. The Last of Us Part 2 had one of the most polarizing audience responses I've ever seen for a video game, that is, until September that same year, and probably the most divisive audience response for any major media release since The Last Jedi or the finale of Game of Thrones. We'll go in depth on the details in just a moment, but for now, let me make some promises. The Last of Us Part 2 is a densely layered work, and is not wholly defined, explained, or analyzed through any single lens. Since this is a retrospective, and since the reception for the game was so varied in substance, not to mention coherence, I'll start by summarizing popular reactions. Upon release, the game received a wide range of responses from critics and audiences. The majority of these can be organized into two major groups. The first of these we'll call objective, good faith criticism, and we'll get to the other one in a moment. On the whole, Part 2's technical prowess was almost universally praised. The high-fidelity graphical output was considered some of the best available on the PlayStation 4, while the game's sound design was described as stunning. The game's depiction of an overgrown Seattle was seen as a natural, positive evolution of the first game's production design, and an exemplary case of environment as story. Similarly improved from the first game was the combat. Three-dimensional maps, sharp new AI, and a revamped arsenal and crafting system created free-flowing and intense new experiences, and encouraged creative thinking to dispatch enemies. Also returning was the first game's composer, Argentinian rock star Gustavo Santaolalla, who with Matt Quayle fresh off of Mr. Robot, created a tortured and haunting hybrid of strings and electronics to underscore the game's pitch-dark themes of violence and revenge. Reactions begin to divide, however, on the interactions between the game's substance and its style. While the development of both story and characters were received as undeniably powerful, debate arose as to whether the narratively necessitated gameplay undercut the ostensibly anti-violent themes of the story. Further criticism was aimed at the game's length, with some calling it punishing at best and bloated at worst, and leading others to name it Naughty Dog's double album when compared to previous productions. Others still questioned if the heavy reliance on combat encounters throughout the campaign was a top-heavy attempt at recapturing the mixture of exploration, story, and combat that made the first game great. Objections were also raised by the transgender community regarding the depiction of Lev, a supporting character in the game who is transgender. Critics called out the use of Lev's dead name by antagonists, as well as the nature of his arc as a tragic one, reducing him to another cis-written story of trans suffering. Supporters, on the other hand, called Lev's story, characterization, and portrayal by trans actor Ian Alexander a major step for representation in gaming, despite any imperfections. My only take on this last issue is as follows. Yes, getting dead named is awful, and if you do it, you're an asshole, but let's also not forget that every character in the game who does it is talking a lot of shit for someone in pipe bomb range. Alright, so we've skimmed the largest points of objective good faith criticism, which unfortunately brings us to the other major group of responses. Okay, remember those leaks I mentioned at the top of the video? In addition to prematurely revealing details of gameplay and level design, the leaks also compromised several cutscenes and plot points. The most shocking of these was not only the fate of Part 1 protagonist Joel, but that player control would also shift to an entirely new character named Abby halfway through the game. Enraged by these perceived lies and subversions, a large faction took to the internet in a massive attempt to validate their frustrations. Some of this stuff is truly disgusting, and I'll try to get through it as fast as possible, but you can also skip to this timestamp to avoid it entirely. In any case, shortly after the game's release, Part 2 was review-bombed on Metacritic, far too fast for any users to have actually finished the real game. The ensuing discourse on this and other sites gave rise to horrible post-release vitriol, or HPV for short. Naughty Dog falsely advertised their game. How dare they attempt to preserve the dramatic impact of the story we care about so much? This has never been done in the history of gaming, and it'll never happen again. Speaking of things having never happened before, there are way too many SJW politics in this game. There have never ever been members of the LGBTQ+ community present in this story up until now. Keep politics out of games, because games are art, and art is never political. And while we're talking about the LQGTB $signs, Abby must be a male-to-female trans character because she's too muscular, she's got a killer jawline, and her breasts are too small. There's no implication anywhere in the game that she's had the time, resources, or the inclination to build up this body in a post-apocalyptic world. It just doesn't make any sense, and I hate it. In fact, I hate it so much, I'm going to threaten to kill Neil Druckmann, co-writer Haley Gross, Abby actor Laura Bailey, and her infant son. That's how change has always come throughout human history. One death threat against a toddler at a time. Oh, wait a minute. I know why Neil Druckmann decided to make Abby the focus for half of the game. It's because he wanted to include the character of Abby's boyfriend Owen as a self-insert so that he could get into a physically unflattering motion capture suit and have real sex with Laura Bailey, also in a motion capture suit, and then put that act into the game. It's bulletproof. Also, haha, fat Geralt punched the hormones out of Lev, ha ha ha. Honorable mentions: a misquoted article implying that Naughty Dog employees were made to look at traumatizing videos of gore to better incorporate it into the game. The game is anti-Christian. Anita Sarkeesian herself had a large hand in the development of this game. And last but not least, Naughty Dog paid for reviews. Druckmann, still waiting on that check, guys. The only positive outcome I can think of that stemmed from the initial backlash to The Last of Us Part 2 is that, for the very first time, I agreed with a Polygon article, published just over a week after the game's release. Many have assumed an air of wariness about The Last of Us Part 2 discourse. It feels as if there are all these larger forces working towards maintaining the status quo when it comes to big-budget games. It's not enough that the game is selling well and that most reviews are positive. You can't fall out of line with that general consensus even as a joke. It's not an environment that is conducive to encouraging honest reviews or critical discussion, which is ultimately a disservice to the game itself. I've played through The Last of Us Part 2 a total of 2 times, once immediately after release and again in anticipation of making this video. Similar to how reactions were divided largely along the lines between the game's design and story, I'll be taking as objective a look as possible at both fields independently of each other, before moving on to a more holistic analysis. Appreciating the constructed universe of a long-developed game is already difficult on one's first playthrough, and with a game as lengthy and as emotionally draining as this one, the details become easy to miss or even overlook entirely. In the instance of Part 2, however, the story's various settings are so natural that they actually avoid pulling direct focus. Carrying over their meticulous speculative design work from the first game, Naughty Dog forges eerily beautiful graveyards out of cities, overgrown and deserted at first glance, yet teeming with danger below the surface. Nature's slow reclamation of humanity's abandoned superstructures 25 years after an effective extinction event is a prime example of environment as storytelling, underscoring the game's themes of savagery and dehumanization. The ruins, untouched for a quarter century, become as much a character as any other, and exploring them during downtime becomes a conduit for a player's morbid curiosity. Part 2's world is deepened further still by a constantly shifting and organic soundscape. Where the first game had a healthy balance between urban, suburban, and rural settings, the hollow, echoing noises of a flooded and gutted Seattle endow Part 2's environments with a three-dimensional pulse of growing tension, especially in anticipation of combat. The combat and stealth encounters of Part 2 manage to occur at both a lethally fast and agonizingly slow pace. Time seems to dilate as you crawl into cover and burn precious seconds crafting new ordnance, before risking a gunshot and scrambling away at the sound of returning fire, dogs barking, or the screech of the infected. The ever-changing rhythm of stealth interrupted by frantic fighting can become tiresome after a few repetitions, but that's the point. Depending on your playstyle and what encounter it is, your enemies are not locked in there with you, you're locked in there with them. Minor improvements to weapon and movement mechanics, as well as the addition of prone controls, sharp new enemy AI, and some truly incredible animation, add to a flowing, if slightly technical experience of these skirmishes. On higher difficulties, meager resources and higher damage mean the difference between life and death, ratcheting up the tension and demanding that players be creative on a relatively small yet satisfying scale. Speaking of satisfying, it should be noted that due to Part 2's overall length relative to the first game, more substantive gameplay elements were necessary to properly pace the dual narratives. While there's a decently measured blend of exploration gameplay, cutscenes, combat, and even a few puzzles, there is a feeling of inconsistency to Part 2's overall playing pace, especially when compared to the tight cinematic pace of the first game. Early on, Part 2 incorporates an open-world element that allows the player some control over the story's acceleration, but beyond that, the reins are held firmly by the script. Another more significant departure from convention comes in the form of Ellie and Abby's respective flashbacks, which, while informing both characters' motivations and involving the player in their unfolding, sometimes detract from the momentum of the present narrative thread. While I am veering from design into the realm of story, the reason I bring it up is because the game's inconsistent pace contributes as much to the tone and atmosphere of Part 2 as the previously discussed in-game elements. Part 2's story deals heavily with the dehumanizing and mentally damaging effects of violence, especially long-term armed conflicts. In this case, it follows that the very structure of the story should expand and contract in unfamiliar places to create a sense of confusion, forcing the player to really concentrate to remember how they got here. But we'll get to that in a second. I'm not gonna lie. This sucked. Playing through The Last of Us Part 2's story is an ordeal. It's part of the reason I've only played it twice for the year that it's been out. The profound emotional depths to which this story dives have been matched by only one or two other works I've experienced in my whole life. By the time it ends, Part 2 demands re-examination of what it means to play a game. So I'll say it again, this sucked. But was it bad? The one thing most can agree on is that Part 2 took a lot of risks. With a concept as large and ambitious in scope as this one, inconsistencies or relative weaknesses are bound to arise. The ultra-violent gameplay sometimes seems to contradict the game's perceived themes of anti-violence, throwing the game's overall tone off. More than a few hanging subplots remain embedded in the overall story, though they're largely non-essential to the plot and can mostly be explained by levels cut for time. Less trivial, though, are some logical improbabilities within the story, which, while necessary for any story, become distracting and threaten a player's suspension of disbelief after some accumulation. Like its predecessor, Part 2 has a single overall sequence of events for the player to play out, with no consequential control over the events themselves. With the possible exception of combat encounters, the player effectively becomes little more than the engine on which the story runs. This was actually a criticism that a friend of mine had regarding the first game. If a cinematic story like The Last of Us can be told with the player doing little more than simply getting the characters into places for the next cutscene, why not just tell the story in a movie, or on TV? However, any detraction from the game's perceived narrative railroading pales in comparison to the reaction of the forced switch of player control from Ellie to Abby. The notion of playing as Joel's murderer, the person you've been hating and hunting for half the game, was enraging for a great many players. In my opinion, the polarized reaction to the game's narrative style is emblematic of the themes it explores. Much of the game is concerned with warring factions, be they Ellie and Abby or the WLF and the Seraphites. The us and them mentality exhibited by the main characters, and by extension us the players, is suddenly and rapidly inverted upon the switch from Ellie to Abby, causing righteous, if excessive, anger. As far as narrative devices go, this change works almost too well at instilling those same emotions in a player, sometimes to the point of wanting to abandon the game entirely. On the other hand, while the exploration of this tribalistic mentality could be considered a success, the game's negotiation of time is just as divisive. The game jumps back and forth from the present to the past and back again in a dizzying sequential fog. While these transitions are mostly used to deepen the respective characters and backstories of Abby and Ellie, it's difficult to keep track of the order of events, especially with the added emotional stress of the story so far. Though it would be easy to, I hesitate to chalk this effect up to another casualty of the game's scale. Weak elements of plot are one thing, and the methods of a narrative's execution are another, and considering the substance of Part 2's themes and story, I don't think this effect of cognitive fog is accidental. Another major theme of Part 2 is the cycle of violence. It's turned the wheels of The Last of Us since 2013. The act of violence that took Sarah from Joel is what eventually brought him to kill Jerry Anderson to save Ellie, which eventually brings Abby to kill Joel, which causes Ellie to pursue Abby, and so on. It's also no accident that this story of revenge is juxtaposed against an ongoing and seemingly endless war of attrition between two armed forces. Despite heavy losses on both sides, they can only curse and demonize their adversary, and focus on how to strike harder, with the original act that ignited the conflict becoming lost in the fog of war. The very same is true of Ellie, her and Abby's stories, and the game itself. No matter how heinous the act that started the war, its cost will always outweigh and obscure it. The story's events are told out of order to endow the player with the same fatigue and confusion that war instills in people. The reasons for its ignition become harder and harder to remember with every passing day of bloodshed, violence, and horror. I think that on these merits, the game succeeds as a statement on war, if not against it. Not because of its content, but in spite of it. The violence on display in Part 2 is nothing short of nightmarish, even by the standards set in the first game. Blood squirts from wounds, faces and limbs become fractured and destroyed, and wounded enemies scream out their final, agonizingly long breaths. After hours of brutalizing soldiers and extremists and outmaneuvering infected just to survive, the struggle to remember what exactly it is we're doing here becomes all the more difficult, until it dawns on you that the act of killing is coming easier to you than the reasons behind it. To find and kill Abby, Ellie embarks on her own war, sacrificing her friends and morals as she proceeds deeper into her own heart of darkness, corrupting herself beyond the point of redemption until all that remains is a desolate shell of a woman, having lost all she loves and yet alive enough to know that it was her fault. The things Ellie loses or destroys on the way to avenge Joel far exceed his death, and by the time she remembers why it hurt so badly to lose him, the game is over. So, to make a long story short, what can everyone agree on? Well, when it comes to stories like The Last of Us Part 2, the simplest truths are usually the best ones. Whether or not the game's story is any good depends largely on who plays it. That's how video games, stories, and pretty much all art have worked since the beginning of time, right? Right, on that we agree. So if you'd like to go on agreeing, congratulations on reaching the end of the video. I upload every other Friday, except for big videos like these apparently, and I'd love it if you'd subscribe so I can keep On February 28th, 2020, myself and a group of my dearest friends gathered to go to the Chicago Comic and Entertainment Expo, commonly known as C2E2. For 3 days, we navigated dense crowds, sweat through our cosplays, beat hell out of our feet standing in line. It was glorious. Probably one of my best convention experiences. I got to meet one of my childhood heroes with my best friend Sam, while my girlfriend Kyle gifted fan art to every member of Critical Role, even Brian, because she cares. Within a month, Chicago was under lockdown. My college closed its residence halls with only a week's notice. Kyle and I packed our homes, lives, and new kitten into a rental van and fled the city to our hometown of Minneapolis. Somehow the month of April flew by, but wouldn't leave either. While quarantining, Kyle and I got a lead on a Chicago apartment to move into at the beginning of June, so at April's end, she returned there to prepare while I stayed with Sam through May. Sure, I was sleeping on a mattress in his basement and talking to my girlfriend through a cell phone screen, but given the circumstances, we could have been worse off. Then, 20 minutes from us, an unarmed man was lynched by police.
In Minneapolis tonight, tensions are high as 4 police officers have been fired after a man was pinned to the ground and died. The incident was caught on camera. NBC's
Minneapolis became a war zone. Buildings and vehicles went up in flames. The National Guard was deployed. My friends and I ran medical supplies to protesters through tear gas and rubber bullet fire from Minneapolis PD. Shortly after Derek Chauvin's arrest on May 29th, I traveled back to military-occupied Chicago and moved in with Kyle. Then, on June 8th, I got news that my grandfather, a widower for 8 years, had died of natural causes. 11 days later, I began my first playthrough of The Last of Us Part 2. By the time I picked up my controller, I was not doing any kind of well. The combined stresses and whiplash of the pandemic, the protests, the move, and my grandfather's passing had ground me down to a state of emotional rawness I'd rarely felt before then. And it was in this state in which I re-entered the world of The Last of Us. For 4 days, Part 2 became my life. While my friends watched, I'd play until 3 a.m., stumble to bed, wake up at 11, and resume play shortly after. It wasn't healthy at all, not physically or mentally, and the game's content certainly didn't help the latter kind. Within a few hours of the game's inciting incident, I was numb to my core, and just as I started to find my footing, the non-linear story structure did its thing and knocked me on my ass all over again.
This is the end. Beautiful friend. This is the end.
Eventually, the game began to take a toll on me like no other had before, not even my favorite game of all time. Firefights began blurring together. Ellie and I endured and committed atrocity after atrocity. I openly considered giving up several times. Ellie's actions and my own complicity in them left such a bad taste in my mouth that in hindsight, it's not so surprising that I went along with the switch to Abby as easily as I did. Better this murderer than the last, right? Though it had nothing to do with playing Abby, I began to earnestly wonder not how, but when the game would end. The world from Abby's point of view was still the unforgiving and bleak reality that it had been from Ellie's, only now its horror was on full, detailed display.
Clip her wings.
If Ellie was descending into darkness, Abby was fighting her way out. And while it was Abby's fight that pushed me to my breaking point, it was the Santa Barbara chapter that ensured I stayed well beyond it until the game was over. By the time I was on that goddamn beach, I no longer cared about how it would end. All I wanted was for it to end. The story, the pain, the insanity of it all. Remember my friend from earlier? I struggled for a while to reply to his quandary regarding player agency in The Last of Us, but eventually I arrived at this conclusion. The rules of good cinematic storytelling state that within around 20 minutes or script pages, you should know who your main character is and be given a reason to care about them. The first game begins with what is essentially a 16-minute semi-playable cutscene, in which the worst thing that's ever happened to someone you've never met before happens. At this point, if you're not sold on caring about Joel Miller, you never will be. From then on, you help Joel fight through the rest of the game not because you're told to, but because you empathize with him. You're with him every step of the way as you meet Ellie, leave Boston, save Ellie a few times, and then get saved by Ellie a few times. Every bullet you fire, every skull you crush, every life-threatening injury you patch up, all during gameplay, is to protect Joel and eventually Ellie, who both you and Joel are starting to fall in love with. The Last of Us would never have had the same emotional impact as a book or a movie because of the deepened layer of empathy that video games can provide. Yes, the story is linear and it doesn't meaningfully engage the free will of the player, but in addition to the pre-written depth of its characters, controlling the movement and actions of those characters when it does count forms an undeniable emotional bond from player to character. The reason you care this deeply about Joel and Ellie is because you helped them through getting impaled, braving the winter, fighting off clickers, and clawing their way to the fireflies. Those characters are alive to live out the rest of their story because you fought to make it so. Because you empathize with them. If nothing else, The Last of Us Part 2 is an interrogation of that empathy. The same emotional connection that drove you to help Joel fight his way across the country is the same fury that drives Ellie to seek revenge for his murder. Whereas our willingness to commit acts of violence in Part 1 was justified for the sake of survival, Part 2 turns that imperative into an ugly instrument of destruction. Once again, the story is on rails and it doesn't engage free will, but where our necessitated actions strengthened our bond to Ellie in the first game, in Part 2, they alienate her from us. So much so that when we're forced to bond with another character that we have every reason to hate, we realize that it comes to us just as easily as it once did with Ellie. By the time we get to Santa Barbara, we've gone through so much for and with both characters that the fight between them is emotionally devastating. Ellie's aggression is hollow, Abby's defense forced. Both have so much to live for. Neither truly knows why they're still there. And all of us holding the controller just want it to be over. By the time the fight is over, it's clear they both do too. Despite its troubled history, this game managed to be released right when it was needed. Neil Druckmann has gone on record saying that where the first game was about love, Part 2 would be about hate. On that front alone, the game is an unrivaled work. At a time where division, grudges, and violence are currency, The Last of Us Part 2 pointedly examined one of humanity's most destructive capacities at its darkest, and did it so well that its team even experienced some firsthand. This is not a game one can easily recommend. It hardly qualifies as a game as far as having fun is concerned. What it is, however, is provocative, harrowing, and infinitely debatable. Perfect for its time and place. Despite some flaws and the ever-present threat of superficial interpretation, the game has to be admired, if only for its capacity to psychologically discomfort its players, immersing them in the perspectives of several victims and perpetrators of the worst possible degrees of hatred imaginable. The measure of an enduring work isn't always in its quality or its substance, but in its defiance of ultimate definition. One playthrough garners an entirely different reaction from another. The game's only constant is in whatever truth a given player takes from it. And in that regard, The Last of Us Part 2 is built to last.